Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Geraint Hughes. Geraint is a reader in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London and has taught at the Joint Services Command and Staff College for over 20 years. He is the author of Britain and the Dhofar War in Oman, 1963 to 1976, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2024. Today, he will explore British involvement in the Dhofar Insurgency and the challenges of fighting an undeclared war. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, you can post a question in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you if you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass over to Geraint and hope you enjoy this talk.
Thank you very much. Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's so great to see such a big audience here. I'm happy, really delighted to see such a massive turnout for a Friday afternoon. So I, as anybody else who's singing for their supper, I hope that what I deliver over the next 45 minutes or so justifies the audience. So let's start with a commonly quoted statistic about the British Armed Forces after World War II. So one of the most, one statistic often gets referenced, often in newspaper articles and obviously in public sources, is that there was only 1 year after the Second World War where the British Armed Forces as a whole, and the Army in particular, were not on operations. In other words, they weren't doing, they weren't fighting in an interstate war, like in, say, in Korea or with the Gulf conflict, with the Falklands. They weren't involved in counterinsurgency, as they were in Northern Ireland, or they weren't doing peacekeeping operations or any other operations of these kinds. There was only 1 year where they weren't doing it, and that was 1968. But even that statistic is wrong, because earlier that year, a platoon of troops was sent to the airfield at Salalah, outside the provincial capital of Dhofar in southern Oman, to help reinforce it. The reason being was that Salalah was actually also a Royal Air Force base. Later that year, a contingent from the RAF regiment is sent to contribute to base defence. And there are also lone service personnel, as they are known, who are integrated with the Sultan's armed forces, the armed forces of the Sultanate of Oman, in command positions and involved in combat. So if we're talking about being in a shooting war, well, this fits the characteristics of a shooting war. But it is one that is genuinely forgotten about. There's quite a few reasons for this. One of them is that it only involves a comparatively small portion of the armed forces as a whole and the army itself, although it has a disproportionate effect, of course, on the Special Air Service Regiment that provides at least one of its squadrons on operations from around about September 1970. At one point, there's two in theatre. So there's that. It touches on a very, very small portion of the British Armed Forces and their families. The other is that the British government wants it to be a secret war. They do not want to have it publicised. So there are Conservative and Labour governments in office during the course of this conflict. What they do agree on, despite all their party political differences, is that they want the minimum of attention drawn to the fact that Britain is involved in aiding the Sultans of Oman at this period in a war against an insurgency. They do not want this discussed. And part of the reason why this is not a particularly well-discussed war is there's a lot of other stuff going on at the time, because this era is the era of the Vietnam War. It's the era of 3 conflicts fought between Israel and its Arab neighbours, of 2 wars fought between India and Pakistan. It is the era of Black September, happening in Jordan in 1970 and an upsurge in Palestinian terrorism or freedom fighting, depending on your side. It is also, of course, for Britain, it is the era when the Northern Ireland conflict erupts in the summer of 1969. And this, of course, becomes the focus of the armed forces effort, in particular the army's efforts. And, of course, it's a period of considerable political and socio-economic turmoil as well. Plus ça change, as the French say. So if there is a reason why there's not a lot of attention being paid to this war, well, it's because there's a lot of other stuff going on. But, of course, it continues to resonate. And if you have heard of this conflict, the chances are it will be because of the Battle of Mirbat, fought on the 19th of July 1972, in which a team, an 8-man team from the SAS, or the British Army Training Team, as it's officially known, along with a platoon's worth of Omani irregulars, are involved in a very fierce firefight with a far larger attacking force from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman and the Arabian Gulf, the insurgent movement. It goes through numerous name changes here. Generally speaking, I'll turn to refer to it by its initials, the PFLOAG. Sergeant Talayasi Laibalaba, who's shown with this statue to him outside the international airport in Fiji, is killed in action. He's one of the 2 men who are killed in action. Laibalaba's feats of valour during the course of that battle are ones which strongly, in the opinions of many people in the regiment, and I'd have to say, for what it's worth, my opinion as well, are ones which in normal circumstances would have won him the Victoria Cross. But because it's an undeclared war, it doesn't get recognised. In fact, recently discovered that shortly after the battle, when the Ministry of Defence is actually dealing with the aftermath of the battle, they contact the Fijian High Commissioner in London with the request that, firstly, they don't publicise Sergeant Laibalaba's death, and secondly, if they get any press inquiries about it, they refer them straight to the Ministry of Defence. If you bear in mind, Fiji itself is a newly independent state. It's had about a year of independence up until that point. A request from the former colonial power is obviously going to have quite a big effect. But the attitude in London is we do not want to talk about this battle, even though it was actually a victory. We just do not want to talk about the fact that the SAS, and in fact, British personnel are there full stop. No discussion at all. So what I want to do is talk about, this is more about the strategy and the context. There are lots of very, very important stories to tell about the fighting in Dhofar. And in this presentation itself, I won't talk much about them, not because I don't think it's important. It's very important, but I actually think the people who should be telling you about them are the people who were there. And there are several veterans of the conflict, of course, who are still alive and in the position to bear testimony to what they did. So this is going to be more about why we were there in the first place and what we were doing and how we won. And the short version of that is there was quite a bit of luck involved. So where is it? Now, some of you are probably already familiar. Pardon me if I'll tell you something you already know, but Dhofar is the southernmost province of the Sultanate of Oman. So you can see that effectively Oman stretches from the Muscat Peninsula, the enclave that is on the southern end of the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, sorry, and then it basically reaches down to the border with Saudi Arabia and with Yemen. Now, during much of the conflict, it's not Yemen, it's the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. Not very popular, not very democratic. But nonetheless, this state, which emerges after the end of British rule in November 1967, is significant because it is a Marxist-Leninist state in terms of its political orientation, and it has quite a significant effect on the development of the insurgency that follows in Dhofar. The oblong that I've drawn there basically shows you roughly where most of the area of operations is concerned. So let's have a closer look at where the area of operations was. So I had the delight of actually visiting Oman, and specifically Dhofar, around about 11 years ago. I'm not going to rattle you through all my happy snaps from that, but just a few just to illustrate, for anyone who hasn't been there, what the terrain is like. So it's very mountainous. There are 3 main mountain chains, the Jebel Qamar in the west, the Jebel Kara in the central part of Dhofar, and the Jebel Samhan in the east. And to give you an idea of the height, so the mountains are around about 3,000 to 4,000 feet in height. That's between 900 and 1,200 metres. So to give you a point of reference, Snowdon in North Wales is 1,085 metres tall. So that is the terrain. You basically have to get up those mountains and fight and basically get up to a plateau, right up in the gods. And up until around about 1970, the Sultan's armed forces didn't have any helicopters. So if, I don't know how many former servicemen we have in the audience, and any people familiar with the likes of Brecon and Dartmoor and various other places, but troops are going to have to go up and down those mountains. And also, if it's little things like casualty evacuation, which is obviously a very important process, they have to come down those mountains before they get helicopters, which can basically airlift them to Salalah Air Base, where they can then be treated. So that is the terrain. It's like a lot of places, it's really, really beautiful if you're a tourist. It's bloody awful if you're an infantryman. So so that's the terrain. What about the climate? Now, this next picture, sorry, here you go. So that is taken in the middle of the seasonal monsoon. So this is July 2014. This is near, I think this photo is taken near Rakhut, near the coast. Does that actually look like anywhere in the Arabian Gulf for anyone who hasn't been there? I mean, it doesn't. I mean, look at the vegetation, look at look at how lush it is. That's almost tropical. And this is, so between July and September every year, Oman, this part of Oman gets the Kharif, the monsoon. And this is the kind of terrain you get, because all of a sudden the Jebel, the mountains, become this lush, almost semi-tropical paradise in a way. But again, imagine fighting through that. Imagine the visibility you'd have if you were on patrol, or if you want to see it from the other side of the street, if you were part of a guerrilla group there. So that is an important piece of the microclimate that's worth bearing in mind. Another monsoon picture. So this is taken from an old position of the SAF, the Sultan's Armed Forces, known as Everest. That's what I could see from Everest in July 2014. And that's what you could see about 3 months later. So imagine the effect of that seasonal mist that descends all on Dhofar. Because when it comes to the Sultan of Oman's Air Force, the SOAF that's providing air support, you're effectively, you're effectively grounded for about 3 months because you can't see anything. You can't, and if you bear in mind the technology at the time, calling in fires, there's no, none of the technology that we have in terms of enabling precision strike. You can't fly. And that's quite significant because the Battle of Mirbat, the insurgents time it when they attack in July 1972. Their presumption is the enemy can't fly. They cannot fly any form of close air support, and they can't fly helicopters to get troops in to reinforce the garrison. This is the right moment to fight. So perhaps another feature I should talk about this is the population. So this is, at the time, it's a very sparsely populated area, 40,000 people living in a province the size of Wales. For reasons connected to my name, I draw quite a lot of analogies of Wales. But 40,000 of them, 10,000 of them are nomads who live in the mountains, and they are also ethnically, by and large, they are ethnically distinct. They're not Arabs. So it's not just the fact that British military personnel serving in Dhofar are strangers to the locals. So too are Omani Arabs who are serving with the SAF, and also we're recruiting soldiers from Balochistan in what's now Pakistan. So they are strangers as well. So in a sense, this is a foreign force fighting on this turf. So a bit of background. Why are we there in the first place? For what reason are the British in this part of the world? Well, we can go back to October 1798, which is when the Al Busaid Sultan signs a treaty with the British East India Company, which is it's a treaty of protection for influence. And that relationship means that Oman is part of Britain's sort of informal empire. There is no Governor-General sitting in Muscat giving orders directly. There is no British colonial service in charge. But Oman is part of the informal imperial sphere. In July 1958, we sign a treaty with then Sultan Said bin Timur, And this leads to the establishment of the SAF, the Sultan's Armed Forces, which I've referred to. So essentially the creation of a standing military, which at the time largely consists of the army and the SOAF, the Sultan of Oman's Air Force. It is led by two sets of people. The first are the lone servicemen. So volunteers from the British Armed Forces serve with the Sultan's Armed Forces for about 2 years. And in fact, the commander of the Sultan's Armed Forces, the CSAF, is a seconded senior army officer. It's a colonel from around about 1958 to 1968. It's a brigadier subsequently, and then a major general after 1972. But you've also got the contract officers. Many of them British, some of them come from overseas, say from Pakistan or from Australia, or even from what we used to refer to as Rhodesia. They are on full-time service with the Sultan's Armed Forces. They sign a contract or agreement. They basically are there for the duration. So instead of being, like, say, a British Army officer who serves 2 years with them and then goes back to his parent unit, they are there permanently. What we get out of this is access to 2 air bases. So one of them I've already referred to outside Salalah in Dhofar. The second is on the island of Mazira. Mazira, as I'll go on to explain, is the one that's more important for British defence interests. That's the one we really would like to keep. So this relationship endures, but we get to start to run into problems after World War II, when you see the period of decolonisation and when you see the emergence of newly independent states, the rise of the non-aligned movements, and then the rise of rulers like Egypt's president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, who are there to basically agitate against the survival of European imperial rule, particularly in the Middle East. So what you then get is this relationship becomes a bit of a political hot potato, because all of a sudden we are involved in a quasi-colonial relationship with Oman. The Sultan is portrayed by his enemies as not actually being a real ruler, he's a puppet, and it's the British who are actually in charge. And Oman itself is not treated as an independent state. And part of the problem here is that the Sultanate contracts its foreign relations to the British. So when it's Foreign Office officials who are explaining that Oman is not actually a colony, you can appreciate that this doesn't quite send the right message. So this evolves as far as overall British influence. It develops during the course of the 19th century. So we have similar relationships with the rulers of what's now, well, obviously, Bahrain, Qatar, and what's now the United Arab Emirates. And everything is overseen by a Foreign Office official known as the political representative of the Persian Gulf, who's based in Bahrain. We also have a military presence in the region up until December 1971, where we pull out all our troops. So we have military bases in Bahrain and Sharjah, which is now in the Emirates. And all of this is in support of, of the local rulers, including Sultan Saeed. And part of the problem about Saeed is he is a rather, well, amongst many things, he's a rather parsimonious individual. He does not like spending money. He does not like borrowing money. And until Oman develops oil, that means that Oman is going to be a very, very poor place indeed. What that also means, of course, is that he's unwilling to actually expend, what you usually get is a situation where any sort of ruler will basically be very parsimonious in lots of things, but will splash the cash for his own armed forces and his own intelligence and security services. And Saeed wasn't even prepared to do that. So just some slides here to illustrate points here. So this, taken from the National Archives, just to give you, obviously this is like the kind of very, very busy map the army really likes, all its map symbols and all the rest of it. But it goes to show, firstly, you've got the location of the 2 British garrisons, and then you've got the locations of the various local militaries that we raised and led, including the Trucial Oman Scouts, which has now formed part of the Emirati military, and the Abu Dhabi Defence Force, SAF, obviously Sultan's Armed Forces. So that was basically part of the part of our influence was not just the troops we had, but the local forces we trained and raised. This is a photo taken from RAF Mazira, again in the National Archives, and that is a signals intelligence station. This is one of the reasons why Mazira was very, very valuable. It was a really good listening post for the RAF and also for government communication headquarters, GCHQ. So the other thing about Mazira was that the runway was actually built so it could take RAF Vulcan bombers, which were carrying the deterrent until 1969. So Salalah was the base we had because we'd been bequeathed it, but Mazira was the one we really, really, really wanted to keep. So let's talk about the war in brief. One of the things about Saeed's rule is that there is a flow Omani expatriates and expatriates from Dhofar itself, who basically leave the Sultanate to work across the Gulf. Many of them, as it happens, joins the military and police services of neighbouring states. And they become exposed to new ideas about nationalism, about socialism, and ideas that basically challenge the old-fashioned and very basically archaic and despotic rule of the Sultan. You have the emergence of what becomes known as the Dhofar Liberation Front, which has very much a nationalist focus. It's quite a small movement. At its height, it's only able to infiltrate around about 100 guerrillas into Dhofar. It is managed and contained by the SAF up until around about the middle of 1968. The change that really happens after the end of the Aden insurgency in November 1961, when we pull out, having lost, and the National Liberation Front takes over in Aden, and it establishes what eventually becomes known as the PDRY, as I described, or South Yemen, as it's known for short. So this has a Marxist-Leninist ideology, and what it means is it establishes a relationship with the Dhofar Liberation Front, but it basically changes the ideology and the shape of it. So in September 1968, there's a conference at Wadi Hamran, and you have the emergence of, to use its contemporary initials, the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf. What they get out of this is support from South Yemen. So they get a sanctuary across the border in Half. They also get training and equipment, which is sort of supplied obviously not just by the South Yemenis, but by other communist powers. And this has a substantial effect. It increases their manpower. It also gives them as a protection from attack by the SAF. It increases the weaponry that they have at their disposal, and they're able effectively to incrementally take control over much of Dhofar between the summer of 1968 and the summer of 1970, because the SAF itself is overstretched. They can only contribute around about a battalion of troops at any given point. On the 23rd of July, you have a Paris coup that overthrows Said in favour of his son, Qaboos bin Said. We're involved. Again, another reason why we don't want to particularly have a discussion about what happened, but we basically know that the coup is happening, and the then CSAF, Brigadier John Graham, is involved, as is the Sultan's own Secretary for Defence, a former British Army colonel called Hugh Oldham. So this is something we definitely want to keep under the carpet, because we want to basically pretend that this has been a purely indigenous process by which Said has been overthrown. He then ends up in exile in Britain for about 2 years before he dies, and then Qaboos takes over. Subsequently, what you see is an expansion of the SAF. It grows from around about 3 battalions, with a 4th that's in training, to around about 7. The Air Force is expanded, particularly with the introduction of Strike Master trainers, which are used to provide air support, and also with the addition of transport helicopters. Its artillery arm grows, it gets armoured cars, it increases its combat power. And you also get the contribution of the SS, or again, going back to the British Army training team as the euphemism, although the BAT also included other personnel, included intelligence personnel. So what you see is then a gradual process of incremental reassertion of control over Dhofar, stretching from east to west. I'll use a map to show this process. You have border clashes that take place between the Omanis and the South Yemenis in May 1972. The crucial development, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the construction of a defensive line known as the Hornbeam Line between over the winter of 1973 and 1974, because this provides a block to the infiltration of the insurgents eastwards, which basically means that much of the population can be concentrated in eastern Dhofar, and where the western Dhofar becomes basically a combat zone for fighting and destroying the rest of the insurgents. There is other external assistance. The Saudis and the Emiratis provide a lot of money, which is important, because at certain points the war is consuming about half of the budget of the Omani state. Even after you get oil and oil exploration, it's still a very, very costly war. But you also get military assistance from the Jordanians and also Iran. A point perhaps worth emphasising here is, bear in mind, this is before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is still in power. And he decides it is in his own interests to assist Qaboos in fighting these insurgents. You have an offensive being launched by the SAF and the Iranians in western Dhofar between December 1974 and 1975. The short version of this is this gradually pushes out the remainder of the insurgency, which has been renamed in July 1974. But there is a fresh series of border clashes that lasts between October 1975 to March 1976. So there is the risk here that this war could actually turn into an interstate conflict. Caboose declares a formal end to the insurgency on Christmas 1975, but there is still ongoing fighting. In fact, the last British lone serviceman to be killed in Dhofar is killed in May 1979 in an ambush with some insurgents in the east of the country. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like on a map, so I referred to the Hornbeam line, so that's the location of the defensive line that basically cuts off the flow of insurgents westwards. You have a set of defensive positions known as the Dianas, which help defend the airfield at Salalah. The Cats are the civil aid teams that are working with the local population. And the darker blue, if you can see them, are basically Omani military personnel. The lighter ones show the Jordanians who are guarding the road to the Midway Road that links to northern Oman. And then you have a brigade of the Imperial Iranian Task Force, Task Force Davamand, as it's known, fighting in the west. The main location of the PFLO is a location known as the Shiri-Shiti Caves, which also acts as their main logistics hub. So, broadly speaking, what do we provide? So it talks about the fact that, yes, they are the loan service and contract personnel for the SAF. Bear in mind that these are volunteers. We cannot send troops to Oman the way that we send them to Northern Ireland or to, as we did previously, to Aden. You have to volunteer to fight in Oman with the Sultan's armed forces. And also the contract personnel themselves, again, are people who, for whatever reason, willingly sign up to be part of the SAF. I've talked about the British Army training team, including the SAS. The SAS are also involved in what is known as Operation Intrudan, which is way up on the other end of Oman, which is the recovery of the Muscat Peninsula, which was nominally part of the Sultanate, but which was actually not really, there wasn't really basically a local governmental footprint. So this takes place in December 1970. The RAF run Mazira, and also there's an a Royal Artillery and RAF Defence Regiment force that is protecting Salalah Air Base. Between 1971 and 1977, there was a squadron of Royal Engineers involved in civil affairs tasks known as Operation Tenable. In early 1973, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary have one of their vessels which is supporting operations on the border with what's now Yemen. There's the loan of a flight of Wessex helicopters in 1974 to replace combat losses that the SOAF had suffered. And then there is also the establishment of the Oman Intelligence Service in 1971, which is subsequently renamed the Oman Research Department. So obviously the Secret Intelligence Service, MI5, the Defence Intelligence Staff of the MOD, and British Army Intelligence Corps are involved in providing intelligence assistance to the Sultan. In fact, by and large, the intelligence effort is dominated by the British. So this involves signals intelligence, photo reconnaissance flights monitoring the border with South Yemen, and also human intelligence support, particularly with the interrogation of captured enemy personnel. But there were limits to what we could do. So there were a suite of plans, contingency plans for intervention, including one which was basically drawn up to actually send British combat troops to fight in Dhofar. This was known as Operation Mahonia when it was first drafted in 1970. A couple of years later, the name changes to Operation Robin, and then by 1974, it's changed to Operation Azalea. So you've got a plan on the table for sending the British Army with Royal Navy and Royal Air Force support into fight in Dhofar. But you have this comment made by Anthony Ackland, who's the head of the Arabian Department of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a very Sir Humphrey-esque way, for those of you familiar with the ex-minister, of saying that this plan is completely unfeasible. There is absolutely no way in practice that we could do what is being planned. That's actually, to use a Sir Humphrey phrase, it is a very bold idea. And why, so the point is that we face very, very significant strategic challenges at this point. We do not want to open up another war in Arabia, particularly after the Aden emergency, which had been a very bruising and damaging experience, not least because I think more recent experience has shown getting the British Armed Forces and the army in particular to fight Arab insurgents face to face is a rather bruising experience. Trust me, it is. So a common point about both the Labour governments of Harold Wilson and the Conservative governments of Edward Heath is they want to keep Dhofar out of political and public discussion. Wilson in particular wants to do this because he knows that the presence of British personnel in Dhofar is going to be like a red rag to a bull to the left-wing faction of his party. It is going to cause him added problems. So there are plans for military intervention, as noted, but it's not even militarily possible, because aside from our own NATO commitments, aside from the fact we have an army of 50,000 troops in Germany waiting for the Russians to come over the border, there's also Northern Ireland. Up in 1972, there are 22,000 British troops contributed to Op Banner during the worst year of the Troubles. And again, it's a case of, well, we've got all this stuff going on. We simply cannot afford a third substantial military commitment like this. Interestingly enough, what you also see is there are fears about what this might mean for Britain, because in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in particular, there's a lot of comments about, well, we sent some advisors and we sent some special forces to work with local troops and local militias, and we've done, we sent a few more, and we sent a few more. My God, doesn't this sound awfully familiar with what's been going on with the Americans in Southeast Asia? You see a constant reference to Vietnam in private documents, and certainly in the official correspondence of the MOD and the FCO. A constant fear that this is going to be that little commitment that goes, but it gets incrementally larger and larger and larger until we're involved in a full-scale war. And if you add to that the economic woes, the oil shock that follows the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and the three-day week, we simply cannot afford another war. In fact, even the scale of the assistance we're providing to Oman is a problem, which is just as well for the Omanis, because the oil shock actually sends their oil revenues skyrocketing, increasing fourfold. So actually what it means is that the Sultan caboose is actually flush with cash at a point when we're about to go to the war. And if you add to that, it's not just the fact that we're worried about getting British troops fighting the PFLAG. We're also worried about the possibility of an open war being fought between Oman and South Yemen, particularly because the South Yemenis are actually infiltrating their own troops across the border to fight with the insurgents. So it's complicated, but to a certain degree it's not. And one of the things that helps us is, by and large, regional opinion is on side. So this is a quote that I found in the archives, which is basically one of Anwar Sadat's senior advisor on Gulf affairs in conversation with the British ambassador to Cairo, where this is in the context of the border clashes that grow up between the Omanis, Oman and South Yemen in May 1972. And Beaumont is basically explaining to Hassan Sabri al-Kholi what the British are doing there in the first place. And when he talks about the loan service personnel and the contract personnel, al-Kholi says, get them out of the front line. He doesn't say, get them out of Oman, because that's what Nasser would have said, and that would have been broadcast on Radio Cairo repeatedly. He just says, get them out of the front line. What he also says is, have as many advisors and technicians and people like that as you want, or the Sultan wants, but when it comes to actual fighting, let Arabs kill Arabs. That's important because the Egyptians are politically very significant as the frontline Arab state, particularly in the fight against Israel, and is the most popular state in the region, and militarily the strongest. So if the Egyptians are basically turning a blind eye to what you're doing, so are a lot of the other Arab states that are not actively contributing and helping the Sultan himself. Because aside from the PDRY, and for a brief period Iraq, very few of the states in the region actually want the insurgency to win. So we benefit from the fact it's not just the assistance that we do get from regional powers, it's also the fact that, by and large, the Sultanate has friends across the region. In fact, Oman joins the UN in October 1971, and it formally joins the Arab League about a month beforehand, largely because the Egyptians basically help to ease their way in. And that's important because that undermines the propaganda line that I talked about earlier about the fact that the Sultanate is seen as a British puppet. If it's been accepted into these two organisations, it's part of the club and it fully belongs. But that doesn't mean that there aren't frictions and tensions between the Omani government and the British government. And bear in mind, the Omani government actually includes people that are actually British. Caboose itself is important here. Now, there is an assumption here that Caboose went to Sandhurst, so he did the course. He spent some time with the British Army in Germany, and all of this stuff, so therefore he was our chap. That didn't mean that he didn't have his own ideas about how the war should be fought, and those ideas often differed from those of people back in Whitehall. The July 1970 coup, as already noted, was a politically very tense event. In fact, it had been very, very difficult until fairly recently to get any evidence that the British government was actually involved. The second point concerned the supply of contract and loan service officers. One of the problems with the latter was they cost more than the former, as far as the Sultanate was concerned. And there was a constant wrangling between the Foreign Office on the one hand and the MOD and the Treasury on the other about whether we should try and commute some of those costs to make it easier for the Omanis to fund their war effort. What was the point of saying we want to help you win, whilst also, as the Foreign Office put it, gouging them over the price of loan servicemen? The contract officers and the loan service officers had a very mixed relationship. They could work very well together, particularly at the tactical level, but there were some frictions. The RAF, for example, insisted that the SOAF had to be commanded by a seconded RAF officer and couldn't be commanded by a contracted officer because they didn't want to have their own person led by their own people led by a contract officer, and rather needless bit of snobbery, in my humble opinion. But one of the challenges here is that contract officers are politically a problem because, again, they're not actually Omani nationals, but they are militarily very useful because they can do things that lone servicemen can't do. So in reference to the airstrikes against South Yemen in May 1972, the British government says we do not want any lone servicemen involved in these airstrikes. But that doesn't rule out contract officers. They can carry out air raids on South Yemen if they are required. And the fiction, of course, is that they are Omanis. They're flying Omani aircraft with Omani livery and roundels on them, even if they happen to be not Omanis. Much the same is true for intelligence, and also when it comes to interrogation of captives, that's left to the contract officers. The financial pressures I've talked about, particularly the fact that both sides are short of money up until October 1973, after which only one of the two parties is short of money. There are requests for direct assistance. So in November 1973, Caboose, during a visit to Britain, actually asks Edward Heath and the Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, for the RAF to be directly involved in carrying out airstrikes in Western Dhofar against the insurgents. Having RAF officers fly Omani aircraft is not a problem, but having RAF aircraft doing it directly is a military problem, because they can only, that means that Salalah is going to be rather crowded with aircraft, and RAF aircraft might perhaps be hit by enemy shelling. And it's also politically a problem, because this looks very much, again going back to Vietnam, it looks like Nixon's bombing of North Vietnam in the Christmas of 1973 too. So Heath and Douglas-Home said, no, we're not going to do this, which again shows the challenges of managing these two strategic contrasts, because Caboose's attitude, Caboose is furious with the fact, for example, that the South Yemenis are getting away with murder, that they are backing insurgents against his rule, and there's no retaliation. At various points, he pushes for not just an airstrikes against South Yemen, against the base at Half, but also a ground offensive, which again, the British government is not prepared to contemplate, because this is what political scientists now refer to as horizontal escalation. That means a war growing in its geographical bounds. There's also vertical escalation, which means the war gets more violent and more people get killed. So you have the institution of what becomes known as Operation DIB, a process of cross-border raids, which I'll talk about in a moment. But just some slides, obviously, to illustrate some points here. So this next one, that shows an overflight by RAF Canberra aircraft, basically close to the South Yemeni border. So they're flying outside of, nominally outside of South Yemeni airspace. They are using oblique camera photography to basically take photos of South Yemeni military positions. A particularly important objective here, shown by the red arrow, is the airbase that the South Yemenis have at Al Ghaida, which actually can take the MiG fighter aircraft that the Russians have rather kindly supplied to the South Yemenis. that is a particular objective, because if they are obviously well within flying distance, theoretically, of Salalah Air Base, if they are able to launch a surprise attack and destroy aircraft and helicopters on the ground, that is going to be a major strategic blow to the SAF. So this is a constant concern of the Sultan in particular. British intelligence thinks that the prospects are rather unlikely. They don't think that South Yemenis are technically capable of launching this strike, but the Sultan is not convinced. So that shows you a Canberra aircraft, courtesy of the great God that is Wikipedia. And this quote, going from the Ministry of Defence files, is quite important because it shows one of the other reasons why these flights were taking place. They were not just photo reconnaissance flights, they were signals intelligence flights. They were listening in to the South Yemenis. And part of it is because what they wanted to do was not just gather evidence on South Yemeni military capabilities, but also their intentions. In particular, what they wanted to do was to reassure Sultan Qaboos that that surprise attack that you're frightened of, we're on it, we're watching it, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen, which again is part of the effort to make sure that he doesn't launch some sort of preemptive attack that destabilizes everything. So the intelligence gathering effort is not just there to help the Omanis, but it is also there to restrain them. I briefly mentioned Operation Dib. Now this is a covert action which actually involved exiles from South Yemen. So there is a tribe known as the Mahra, or Mahri if you're referring to them as plural, which is right on the border with Oman. There was actually a lot of insurgent fighting against the Marxist government in South Yemen, and the Mahri were particularly activists in this. And so we, using the SAS, we trained a band of Mahri known as the Firqa Arbadia. I believe that stands for the Desert Militia. And we trained them for cross-border raids into South Yemen. Now, the real reason here for these raids, and it's shown again by this document here, is it wasn't so much actually trying to inflict any form of military pain on the South Yemenis. It was demonstrative. Our reasoning was, if we train these exiles to carry out covert operations raids, it will reduce Sultan Qaboos's wish for us to carry out overt military raids with the SAF. So the intention here is to keep, basically this is demonstrative. This is basically to pacify the Sultan and to keep him happy and to stop him from basically going for some more bigger and larger military operations which could end up provoking a wider war in the region. So, in conclusion, what's interesting about obviously, one of the things, we historians are commonly say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Obviously, that's an old Mark Twain saying. And it's interesting when you look at current British government documents, for example, the recent Strategic Defence Review that was published. So it talks about sub-threshold warfare, about conflict below the threshold of an overt war like the one that is currently being fought in Ukraine. And there's also terminology about so-called hybrid war, about the mixture of military means with non-military means, and also grey zone warfare, which effectively involves fighting in a context where there's no formal declaration of hostilities, but there is still military activity going on. And the fact of the matter is, even though those terms are today's terms, if you had a veteran of the SAF in this room, if you have officials in Whitehall who were surveying the conflict, they would probably look at this and go, well, we don't recognise those terms, but that was basically what was going on in Dhofar. Because this was an undeclared war. We still had diplomatic relations with South Yemen, by the way, even though they were basically supporting the insurgency. So another problem here was, and it's very similar to now, is that the British Army and the armed forces as a whole were still having to prepare for World War III. They were still having to prepare for a clash with the Russians. This time it would be in Germany, not Estonia. But they were preparing for major combat operations, for full-on war, whilst they were conducting this discretionary advisory operation on a bit of a shoestring basis on the other side of the world. So again, plus ça change. The British Army and the armed forces have always been overstretched. They've always had more jobs to do than they have people and capabilities to do them. Which means that it was particularly important that we had external assistance, we had external aid. The Iranians can send a brigade of troops to fight in Dhofar, which is something we can't do. They could send a task force from their own navy. They could provide a substantial portion of air power and also air defence, again, to help deter the South Yemenis from launching any form of strike. The Jordanians sent a special forces battalion, and they sent some combat engineers as well. All of that's useful, but also it is not just the troops on the ground, it's the financial support as well that the Saudis and the Emiratis help provide, which helps keep the Omanis in the war. There's a lot of emphasis on what the SAS do. This is not surprising. There is a lot of interest in them. We have certainly we talk a lot about their operations in the post-war period. See to a certain degree that it gets glamorized. Obviously, we've seen numerous TV series about them and dramatizations of their activities. It's important, and I can talk a bit more about this in the Q&A. But it is one facet of this war. It fits in with an overall pattern of operations, and actually, this is why. Peter de Abilia is a little bit misleading in his memoirs when he basically talks about the fact that it's the SAS that generate the strategy to win in the war. It's not. They are just a part of that effort. Another point here is it warns us of the problems of hindsight, because when you look at this as a historian, you're in danger of imposing this sort of mental map on the course of events. There's almost a linear narrative. You're losing, now you're winning. And certainly you do see this in some of the literature, but in fact, it's a constant, hard fight to recover control of Dhofar. And there are various points where British officers and officials involved or witnessing the war either say, we're going to lose, even after 1970, after the caboose gets into power, or they say, this war's just going to go on forever. We're never going to win. The insurgents are just going to keep fighting, and no matter how many losses we inflict on them, no matter how many of them surrender, they're just going to keep fighting. This also provides another point for perhaps for observation today, because there is very little media coverage of this war. And also, people don't have smartphones. They don't have social media. They don't have drones. They don't have all this stuff, which means that we can actually get some very vivid image of fighting in Ukraine, for example, or to take something rather more horrific, the recent atrocities that have been filmed in Sudan with the rapid support forces taking over most of Darfur. All of this stuff happens in a media vacuum. But can you imagine in Dhofar, in July 1972, in the Mirbat, insurgents flying drones and getting footage of the SAS and their local allies fighting off this desperate attack and then editing it for their own purposes, or other occasions where SAF or Iranian offensives against guerrilla positions faltered. Can you imagine what it would have been like? I'm not sure we could have done what we did today in the environment that we are in now. Anyway, thank you. I've actually gone on for a little bit longer than 45 minutes, so I should shut up now and give you all the chance to ask some questions.